This is Tom Robleski, the senior opinion writer for the Staten Island Advance, podcasting today in our continuing series on the United States of weed. And I'm going to introduce my co-panelists and colleagues here, let them speak for themselves.
I'm Eric Bascom. I'm a trending news reporter here at the Staten Island Advance.
And I'm Kristen Dalton, a public interest and advocacy reporter for the Staten Island Advance.
Now, this has been a big project that the Advance has been doing. As we know, we all got little pieces of it here and there, but I guess it's really being spurred a lot. Legalization in other states, including Massachusetts. We have New Jersey is looking to legalize, and Governor Cuomo here in New York has put a panel together. So I'll just throw it out to you, Eric, and just to say, I mean, is now the time to start talking about legalizing recreational marijuana in New York State?
Well, it certainly seems like it, especially like you noted with it going on right across the bridges in New Jersey. It seems like they're pushing very hard for that. So it seems like it's kind of right on our doorstep, and it's going to come here whether we want it or not, whether it be brought back across state lines, which is obviously a big issue. So it seems like at this point, the medical marijuana program in New York is so limited and so underutilized, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. So it seems like at this point, if people are going to be using it anyway, it seems like a good time to at least start the discussion. So,
Kristen, let me ask you, I mean, positives for in terms of, why should we, outside of medical reasons, why should we legalize recreational marijuana? Not to say that this is your personal opinion, but just to take a devil's advocate side.
Well, I don't want to say that, people are doing it anyway. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean, okay, well, people are doing this, so let's make it legal so it's not a crime anymore. Right. But given the fact that, there have been efforts to, drop crimes for, possession of marijuana, they're not, prosecuting people the way that they used to for having a certain amount on them, and no longer, if you're caught smoking or if you have a clipped, rolled joint or what have you, you're not going to get in as much trouble as you are anymore. So it already seems like they're kind of maybe paving the way for that. So I think, it would be beneficial in that sense, to not have to worry about it anymore in a criminal sense, And we hear this from our, our commenters all the time when we post about, an article and about arrest for dealing with weed. Well, aren't there better things, that the cops could be doing, or go after the opioids, or go after this? Weed isn't, a drug. So there already seems to be, at least in the community, some kind of thinking that, it's not a drug.
And I think you touched on, Eric, talking about the law enforcement angle of it and the difficulty that police already have in states where it has been legalized, in neighboring states where it's not legal. There's no real test for when you pull somebody over by the side of the road. But what are some? And also, we are on Staten Island, and we are in the middle of an opioid crisis on Staten Island, a drug crisis. Is this really the good time to have a conversation about introducing, yet another drug? Because we know if you're going to set a legal age, that's one thing. You all know that, kids underneath that age are going to do that. So why? So is now the time to talk about that?
Well, it's interesting. In one aspect, you need to look at, certainly when you're talking about legalizing marijuana, is the effect it'll have on drivers and whether people will be driving under the influences. We touched a little bit on the law enforcement aspect of it. And so that definitely is a concern in states where it's been legalized up to this point, and it's something that needs to be addressed. Officers are being trained in different ways to drug recognition specialists to kind of determine what the cause is in. But I did look up some numbers, and this is from an article in the Denver Post. And so from the 2013, which is the year before recreational marijuana was legalized, to 2016, Colorado saw a 40% increase in fatal crashes, which is a pretty significant number. But the more significant number from the article was the number of drivers who had tested positive for marijuana during that same time span, had jumped 145%. So there were a significant amount of more fatal crashes occurring after the legalization, and there was also an even more significant amount of people that were testing positive. Now, whether that's because officers are now looking for it and they're now trained to test it, there may have been the same amount of people driving high this whole time, and we just didn't know about it.
Right.
But either way, if we're going to, legalize it and not necessarily encourage, but allow people to do it in their day-to-day lives, we certainly need to at least examine the effects that it'll have on us, especially from a safety and transportation perspective.
Well, I think one of the arguments we're going to hear, and Kristen, you kind of sort of going in this direction before as well, is and I know this is true in Denver and in other places, the money that could possibly be made, tax money that could be made. You're selling marijuana legally. You're sort of, you may not eliminate the black market. I don't think you do, because government
it's never
will tax.
Going to go away.
I don't think it'll ever go away. But I mean, you could say, hey, listen. I mean, I think Denver, Colorado, since they legalized, they've seen $500 million in tax revenue. So I mean, and I guess they could say, hey, we're going to have that in New York, and that sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in Denver, it actually went towards education. They were opening schools, they're expanding programs. The community and the state saw the money. And everybody knows, obviously, funds are lacking, whether it's to fix infrastructure, transportation, parks, whatever it is, money is needed. But if that's the route that we're going to take, then we have to hold them accountable. We want to be able to see, okay, well, you got, $300 million in tax revenue. Where's the breakdown?
Right.
Let's see the potholes fixed. Let's see the school programs expanded. We just have to make sure that we hold people accountable, because it's so easy to say, oh, we're going to have all these, all this new tax money and do all this good stuff with it. But you need to we want to see the results.
Well, I think about this a lot in New York, because we had the lottery when they, instituted the lotto in New York. Oh, all that money's going to go to education, or the money's going to go to mass transit, whatever. And we've had casino gambling for the last couple of years in New York. And meanwhile, we still don't have money for schools. We still don't have money to fix the subways. So, I mean, I'm not sure. And also Massachusetts, for example, they legalized a few years ago, and now they just doubled or tripled the taxes on marijuana. So actually, I think that's something that's going to make sure that the black market probably stays in business, because the weed's probably going to be better than what you're going to get from the government. Also, it's probably going to be cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tax is definitely a big part of it. If we're going to be taxing people as heavily as they are in some of these states for this recreational marijuana, which in Colorado currently there is a 2.9% sales tax, but then on top of that, a 15% excise tax and a 10% special sales tax, bringing the total tax to about 28% for recreational marijuana in Colorado. So that's a significant amount extra that you're paying. If we are going to tax that heavily, then like you guys said, these politicians need to be held accountable for the money that's being generated and make sure that it's being put to use. I mean, in Colorado, from what we're being told, at least it is, CNN Money article from July 2017 by Aaron Smith noted that, as you said, over $500 million in the first few years, $506 million in revenue had been generated. According to the article, most of the money had went to schools, with the rest of the money going to drug prevention and treatment programs.
Isn't there an irony there, though?
Yeah, absolutely.
They create the situation, and then they use the money to treat the situation.
I think it's for other drugs. I don't think that it's for people to check into rehab for the marijuana.
So these guys get high so we can help the other guys.
But I mean, we were talking about earlier, and I'm sure we'll touch on later, the opioid issue that we face here on Staten Island and really across the country at this point. So if you're going to be using that money, it's going to education, it's going to help other struggling addicts, drug addicts, whatever it may be, and then towards regulating the industry. I mean, that's an ideal way. I mean, everyone has their own different ideals, right? But that seems like a good use of the revenue that's being generated. But like you said, it's a matter of if that money goes where they say it will go, and you can never really tell. And
Kristen, I'm going to jump off on that. Some of the reporting that you had done, I believe we were talking about marijuana's uses for folks who are trying to get off of opioids, or, I mean, you want to touch on that a little bit, how that could also be a positive, I suppose? Yeah,
so there seems to be a split when it comes to using marijuana to help with any kind of other drug problem.
Right. I've use a drug to solve another drug problem.
Yeah, and the split seems to be with people who have a substance use disorder and that are addicted to some kind of opioid, whether it be prescription pills or heroin. And then the other side of it is the providers. So some of the people who are in recovery that I spoke to, for some stories I've written, said that they used marijuana to help with the withdrawal when they were detoxing. You know, it helped with the pain that they were going through. You know, they shake and their joints ache and there's a lot of physical pain. They get nauseous, they throw up. The marijuana helped with that. It allowed them to sleep, and it really helped that process along. A lot of people, you know, who say that they want to get clean, that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of that withdrawal process. And it certainly doesn't sound like fun. So, you know, this is a way that could ease them and might actually, you know, and some people say it has helped them. But then from the provider and the doctor perspective, they're like, well, like you said, you know, why give them another drug?
Well, it's probably better than methadone from what everybody says, or other, like these other drugs, these sort of maintenance, you know, drugs as well.
And this would just be used for that withdrawal period, and then they don't use it anymore. You know, it serves its purpose, and then they move on. And I actually, there's if you go in the National Institute for Drug Abuse, it does say, I'm just going to read something here really quick. It says early exposure to marijuana in adolescence, you know, can mess up basically the way your brain it works with dopamine and the reward center. And it says, to the extent these findings could help explain increased vulnerability for addiction to other substances later in life. But then it also goes on to say that, however, the majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use harder substances, and that further research is needed to, you know, explore this. And there was also a study done at the University of British Columbia with some researchers from California and Florida that says, you know, research shows that people may be using cannabis as an exit drug to reduce the use of substances that are potentially more harmful, such as opioid pain medication. So it is being, you know, it is being looked into, and obviously it seems that there are some benefits too, but with this all being so new here, you know, in the United States and not even in New York yet, it's definitely something that needs to be, you know, studied more.
Eric, did you want to jump in on something there?
Yeah, and I was going to say, just theoretically, it could also be used not only from a treatment standpoint when you're trying to wean off of the drugs, but also in terms of prevention, because we mentioned earlier that New York has one of the most strict medical marijuana policies in the country, and it really doesn't do a lot for many people, and they don't really utilize it to the extent that they could. But, you know, medical marijuana for many people, for professional athletes, for just day-to-day workers, has been, you know, shown to provide a safer alternative to pain relief than some of these prescription drugs. And we know that a lot of these addicts, they start off by being prescribed these drugs, whether they have a surgery or whatever it may be. They get these drugs from someone. They have so much pain, they take them, they become physically dependent on them, and then, you know, the drug's taken away, their prescription's gone, they could either turn to, you know, heroin or something else like that. So if that wasn't necessarily the case, if we have a safer alternative, if a doctor could say, you know, for the pain tolerance, I can prescribe you these addictive opioids, or a legitimate medical marijuana program that would work, unlike kind of what we have going right now, then maybe these people wouldn't get, you know, caught on these drugs to begin with. So, you know, a pound of cure worth an ounce of prevention. Let's edit that one out. Mix up the quote. But point being, it can be used not only to necessarily wean people off, but also to kind of help them not get addicted in the first place.
Well, and for folks who don't know, the main restriction and one of the things that differentiates New York's medical marijuana program is that smokables are not allowed. I'm not sure edibles are. I mean, you can't get I think it's a vaping thing. I know you definitely can't smoke. Under the new, and also, but to get to the point about doctors prescribing, though, also there is a reluctance on the part of a lot of physicians,
and they've had to change some of the legislation.
Even if the program is legal in a state, a lot of doctors don't want to go near medical marijuana. And I understand too that there's still the federal stricture is still in place, which, you know, you can argue with whether it's still listed as, you know, a Schedule I drug, along with, you know, because the federal government does not recognize officially that it has a medicinal use.
Right, and that's why also nurse practitioners have been included in the New York State legislation that allows you to prescribe medical marijuana. So it's not just the doctors. They're doing it. If the doctors don't feel comfortable doing it, they can tell one of the nurses working in their office or at a hospital nearby that they know to go to them and prescribe it, so it doesn't necessarily need to show up on their record.
But even if it does help in all those medical instances, and maybe, Kristen, you could talk us, I mean, is that still a good reason to be like, well, let everybody have have it then? Or should it just be, well, let's talk about making the medical marijuana program better for people and maybe include other conditions and, pain conditions and other things, which they are doing. But does that really mean that it's like, well, everybody who wants to, have it should have it?
I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier at the beginning about how it's become so commonplace at this point that it's kind of happening around you all the time without you even realizing right now, particularly with the way that smoking has changed over the years, is that obviously a lot of people point to the fact that, the weed is a lot stronger now than it was back in my day, and that's a big difference. But the real difference has been the technology associated with weed and the ways in which that it can be consumed now, and that it's happening literally everywhere, and you don't even know, in restaurants, in bars, in movie theaters, in parks. And I think it's interesting, too, to kind of look at what the perspectives have been surrounding weed and how they're kind of changing right now. So I know as part of our United States of Weed project, we launched an extensive survey of some of our readers, our viewers, whatever they may be.
Hopefully they're both.
Yeah, hopefully. In this
we
day
appreciate
and age.
that, folks. Thank you.
And listeners at this point.
Hopefully there'll be a couple.
So we did survey over 2,000 people, Staten Islanders, and 75% of them had admitted to using marijuana recreationally at least once, which is a decent amount. And then when we asked them how recently they had used it, 44% had said in the last week and another 9% in the last month. So that's 53% total within the last month had smoked. That's a good amount of people on Staten Island that are smoking on a fairly regular basis. And not only that, I think the more interesting thing was when we asked people about their kinds of their feelings on weed and whether they think it should be legalized, how it should be regulated, and those kinds of things. And so 78% of the respondents to our survey said that they believe that weed should be legalized recreationally in New York State. So 78% of the Staten Islanders that responded to our survey, that's a pretty good amount. And even the ones we talk about gateway drugs, and we talk about kind of the perspective of should your teen be smoking weed, is it going to lead them to other things, if you open up Pandora's box, all that kind of things. 72% of survey respondents said that they didn't view marijuana as a gateway drug, which is also a pretty high percentage considering that's kind of a sentiment that's thrown around pretty regularly. But then when you break the numbers down a little bit, they start to make more sense. The younger people that responded to the survey almost all said that it wasn't a gateway drug. But as you got older, once you get to the age range of 45 and above, the numbers that thought it was a gateway drug skyrocketed. So it's interesting to kind of look at the changing perspective right now and see, while the youth seems to be embracing it, which isn't really a surprise, that always seems to be the case in these kinds of movements.
They did back in the 80s and the 70s too, by the way.
Exactly. Unfortunately, though, the youth isn't always the ones to go out and vote. So or to necessarily get a lot of things done. So if the older generations are the ones that are, really, still opposed to this, and if this is going to go to a statewide vote necessarily, I'm not sure that it'll be as, one-sided in terms of weed winning as people may think it is, because I think the thought is New York is fairly liberal now, and it's all these a lot of young people.
City, not New York State. I was just going to say
it's New York City, though.
Upstate's a whole different kettle of fish.
Well, that's true. So I just think it's interesting to kind of look at the fact that it seems like a lot of people here on Staten Island are in favor of it, but I'm not sure that it would necessarily pass as easily as people think it would.
I think the gateway drug argument changes when you legalize, because back in the day, if you were buying weed from the weed guy or the weed gal, chances are the weed guy or the weed gal was selling other stuff too. Maybe was selling microdot, maybe was selling coke, maybe was selling acid or whatever. So you're making the visit, you're making the pick, and it's like, hey, do you ever think about trying this? You ever think about trying that? And I think that's, or you've got your buddies, like, hey man, I've got this. Let's put this on, angel dust, whatever the thing was. Or I tried,
interesting child.
Or I tried this. Well, my learnings and I read a lot of books, So I think if you're having it as legal, where you're just going in and you're getting your gummies, you're getting your, your smokables, you're getting your edibles or drinkables. They'll probably have one of the, I guess weed coffee weed tea and all of a sudden sodas and everything. Yeah. But you seem to have a lot of experience here as well.
Well, then my thing is the people who want to try angel dust, anything else, they're going to look for it anyway. They're going to look, I don't think that can necessarily be.
It's not like the old
they don't go
commercials.
Go hand in hand like, buy a dime bag and we'll throw in a hit of acid. Like, I don't think that's how it works.
No, the question is how easy should we make it for people to get marijuana? Now you have to kind of seek it out. You got to know somebody. And listen, it's easy enough. From what I understand, it's plenty easy enough. People are growing their own, whatever else. But it's like, should we make it easy by the government saying, like, okay, come down to the corner store? And maybe you're right. Maybe in New York City, which generally drives the vote of any state election, in general, you'll have enough votes down here to pass it. Upstate is a little more conservative. Mm-hmm. There, it's more suburban. It's more rural. Although now I'm 54. I'll be 54 this year. My generation and older generations were the generations that smoked weed all the time anyway.
That's true.
So, 60, and I have friends who are older than me, whatever, not naming names, who, have the glass of wine, quote unquote, hit a weed and whatever else. And they're like, yeah, well, why shouldn't we? Not just because everybody else, but because here I am. I'm 60 years old and I'm fine,
Yeah.
Yeah. And you talk about if we should really make it easier for people to get weed, but making it hard on people to get weed seems a little silly at this point, right? We've loosened the regulations on it, we've decriminalized it, and there are situations where, like Kristen mentioned earlier, when we tout these weed busts on our site, people laugh at us and say, "Wow, these cops don't have anything better to do." I have friends who got pulled over smoking a blunt in their car on the South Shore, and the cops told them, don't be an idiot, put that out, like, we've got better things to do. Right. And they let them go about their day. So if that's the case, and that's kind of the way that certain people, even police officers, are viewing it at this point, is there really a need to make it hard on people? Should people really be worried about, I'm going to get arrested because I want to get the weed that I want to smoke and relax?
When the city of New York tells you you can carry an ounce of weed on you and you'll get a ticket, and frankly, they're not going to care if you pay the ticket or not, I think that horse is already out of the barn.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So why does it matter then if we, at this point, if it's easy enough, as you say, why even bother using the manpower or wasting the time having these people patrolling or wasting their time with weed?
A weed stakeout somewhere at the South Shore. We've got this house we're watching.
When we get those big busts, though, you would have to think that was the case, right? They didn't just happen upon someone with 3 pounds of weed. They were staking it out for a while. Maybe they had found one of his customers on the street, right, and he caught him with a dime bag, and they said,
"I got it from him.
We'll let you go if you tell us who it is."
They leaned on
I've
him.
heard of that happening before.
Of course, well, that's how it happens
in the neighborhoods.
And a lot of those weed dealers are actually dealing other stuff as well.
Exactly, yeah, but
maybe it's not bad to knock them down once in a while. A guy who's got a bale of weed in his house. Come on. I think, just speaking to that exact point, I think we've already been on that path, because in every state you look at that's come to legalization of recreational. Starts with medical, and it starts with a very limited amount of medical for like kids with seizures, stuff you can't really
compassionate care.
People in stage 4 or whatever, you feel like a monster arguing with, and then they kind of spread it to now it's PTSD or people with chronic pain, because isn't it better than opioids? And PTSD are servicemen and women, and you can't argue with that. Mm-hmm. Those people are, and then it's kind of then it becomes normalized. And then it's kind of other places are doing it. Why shouldn't we do it for recreational? And I come from the generation where it was not a negative, where smoking weed was kind of okay, you're smoking weed. It's better than doing coke. It's better than doing heroin.
Where was that shift then? That's what
I don't know if it came
madness.
I don't know if it came in the 90s when heroin really came back hard. In the early 90s, and then when you got into the whole pill culture in the early 2000s, when people saw that families and let's be honest, when it spread out of certain communities and started hitting all communities, like on Staten Island, it was no longer a North Shore, quote unquote. We know what that's code for. It was South Shore as well. And I think that people say, hey, this is really bad stuff. And also, stuff is getting so powerful. The heroin these days will kill you in the first step. Fentanyl will kill you. You used to be like, hey, you ought to try this, and your first try could kill you. Yeah. And opioids, you'd be addicted in a week. Not even.
Well, that's kind of funny, though, that the rise of all of these stronger, more dangerous drugs kind of shifted the mentality towards weed, which is kind of a lesser in that sense.
A flight to mellowness.
Right, yeah. So people are, you talk about the rise of heroin and prescription pills and all the people doing cocaine and all of that kind of stuff. And then as a result, people are more afraid of weed. That doesn't necessarily
No, I think what's happening is we've got to go back to
all drugs?
We've got to go back to a safe high. I think that's why you're seeing. Let's go back to a
now we're shifting back.
Let's go back to a safe.
But I don't know why we ever shifted to. If you were saying oh, it was fine in my day. Everyone was like, oh, you're smoking pot. Who cares? And then like the rise of other drugs made people against weed.
I think
everything just get lumped together.
I think everything got lumped together.
Programs that they give the kids in school,
especially when you look at the Rockefeller drug laws in New York State and people going to jail for years for having an ounce of weed or whatever. And I think we had that, and then we said like, listen. That's messed up. We can't be doing that. Not everything. And now we're seeing stuff that's not just maybe bad for you, stuff that's deadly for you, and deadly for you first time out. So now we're saying. So now people's like weed. It's like, boy, if only my kid, if only they were if only they were smoking weed. I mean, we're not encouraging people to smoke weed, but I think that's part of that mentality.
But if your other option is heroin,
right? Or if it's fentanyl or weed, bro, Anyway.
And no matter what, I mean, there's always going to be somebody against it. I mean, alcohol, there are, there's people that are very against alcohol, too.
But not to the same extent, which I think is interesting.
Mothers against drunk driving and all
understandably so.
Then that's a big change since when I was a kid. A big change, because back in the day, I mean, people were rolling around with a six-pack on the car seat next to them. And then that changed like almost overnight. It's like smoking anywhere. It's the same thing. People's like, you know what? You can smoke, but don't smoke in the restaurant. Don't smoke in the elevator. Don't smoke on the plane. And, don't drink, don't have 15 beers and go driving. Even though people, again, still going to do it.
At this point.
People are still going to do it, obviously, because there's some people still going to do that.
Well, I guess we're just going to, have to wait and see what happens.
Right. Well, I think we're definitely heading down. Down the road. All those signs are there. And when Jersey does it, that's going to cause a sea change here on Staten Island, I think, and people are going to be going back and forth over those bridges. And I think that at that point, it's either going to be somehow stop it or, join the party.
I feel like that's just, if New York doesn't get on board, or, as far as Staten Island is concerned, with such easy access to New Jersey, it's going to create a nightmare for law enforcement and things like that. Like you said, they said, oh, don't you have we have better stuff to do.
Right.
And at that point, I feel like it's wasting resources and time. I think we need to find that balance somehow.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what the results kind of are from Cuomo's little panel group that he has going. Because we discussed, there are clearly many issues surrounding this. This isn't something that, like you said, I don't think that the best way to go about it is to just legalize it and then figure it out from there. Since we have other states that it is a small sample size still, 2014, but we've got at least a few years under our belts of looking at what's going on in other states and how it's affecting them, and things like driving, things like employment status, how it'll affect that. We actually didn't even get to touch on that, but there are things that if we were to legalize it recreationally, it would impact the day-to-day life of New Yorkers, and it's something that needs to be considered more, and it's why we're having this conversation.
And wouldn't we love to be those lawmakers on the junket? It's like, we got to investigate this weed thing. Let's go to Oregon for a week.
Yeah. Must have been nice.
It's not a bad work trip.
We'll just leave it there. And this is Tom Robleski, senior opinion writer for Staten Island Advance, United States of Weed, with
Eric Bascom, trending news reporter,
and Kristen Dalton, advocacy reporter.
And thanks for listening, and make sure you come back.